Alright, the factoring test. So tomorrow you'll be taking a test on factoring. It's going to cover everything that we've covered the last 2 weeks, including factoring by taking the greatest common factor out. Okay, so the first two problems, we are factoring by taking the greatest common factor out. So when you're factoring by taking the greatest common factor out, you're first going to want to look at your coefficients and see if there's a greatest common factor with your coefficients. Now, if we look at 8 and 22, it looks like there is a greatest common factor of 2. So that would be the first thing that you take out. Then you'd look at your variables. Now remember, in order to take out a variable, in order to factor out a variable, it has to be present in all the terms in the polynomial. So if we look at number 1, we have an x here, and I'll go ahead and put a blue mark over the x. We also have an x in the second term, therefore we can factor out an x. Now, to determine how many x's you can actually factor out, you would need to look for the variable that has the lowest exponent, which in this case would be this 3. And that tells you that you'd be able to factor out 3 x's, or x to the third. And then you would look at your other variable here, y. All right. Do we have a y in the second term? Yes. So that means that we can, in fact, factor this out. Now, again, to factor out a variable, you would need to look for the variable with the lowest exponent, which in this case would be this y to the fourth. And we'd be taking that out. It'd be y to the fourth. And then we divide. So if we divide 8, which is our first coefficient, by 2, we get 4. If we take 3 x's out of x to the third, which is this right here, we wouldn't have any more x's left. So, and same goes with the y. If we take 4 y's out of this, we wouldn't have any y's left. So all we're going to be left with once you factor this out is just 4. Then that's going to be minus. So if we factor out 2, that'd be 22 divided by 2, which is 11. Right? Then we have x to the fifth. If we take 3 x's out of x to the fifth, we'd only have 2 x's left, so it would be x squared. And then we have y to the sixth. If we take 4 y's out of y to the sixth, we'd only have 2 y's left, so it would be y squared. And that would be your final answer factored out. Alright, now number 2 has 3 terms, so it's a trinomial. So first you would look at your coefficients and try to identify a greatest common factor with all 3 of these terms. Now all 3 of these terms are can be divided by 3, so therefore the greatest common factor for all 3 of these terms is 3. That's the biggest number that we can divide all 3 of these by and not get a decimal. So if we take a 3 out, before we take a 3 out, we'd have to look at the variables. So it looks like there is an m in all 3 variables, at least one m. So we can take out at least one m. Now how many m's can we take out? Well, that would depend on the lowest exponent, which would be 2. We could take 2 m's out. Now, n, on the other hand, we have an n here, we have an n here, we don't have an n here. Therefore, we cannot take an n. That's all that we could take out. Then we start our division. First, we would divide 21 by 3. 21 divided by 3 is 7. If we take 2 m's out of m to the fifth, we only have 3 m's left. And we did not do anything with this n squared, so we would just bring it down n squared. Next, if we factor out 3 from 6, that would mean that we divide 6 by 3, so we would have 2 left over. If we take 2 m's out of 3 m's, we would only have 1 m left. And we didn't do anything with the n, so we're just going to bring the n down. And then last, if we factor out a 3 from 15, that would mean that we would divide 15 by 3, which would give us 5. And if we take 2 m's out of 2 m's, we wouldn't have any m's left. So this would be your final answer. Alright, factor the following difference of squares. So these are difference of squares, so therefore we'd be looking for square roots. Remember, to factor difference of squares, it's a squared minus b squared equals a plus b, a minus b. Now the key word here, though, it has to be a difference. Alright? And if it's not a difference, if it's not subtraction, then you wouldn't be able to do it. Okay? So this difference of squares here is subtraction, and it is a 2 squares. So what we would do is we just take the square root of each. All right, the square root of 1 is 1. and the square root of 25 is 5. Square root of n squared is n. And then it would just be 1 minus 5n. Alright, next we have w to the fourth minus 100. So again, we have a difference. It's a subtraction. And we have two things that we could take the square root of. Square root of w to the fourth is w squared, and the square root of 100 is 10. So it'd be w squared plus 10 and w squared minus 10. And then the last one, we have 196a squared minus b squared. So again, everything can be, we could take the square root of everything, and we do have a minus sign here. So square root of 196 would be 14. Square root of a squared would be a. And then that's plus square root of b squared, which is b. And then repeat everything just with a minus sign this time. Now, if you were to get something that looked maybe like this, 49a squared plus, let's say, 16. You might be saying, well, you could take the square root of 49, you could take the square root of a squared, you could take the square root of 16. Sure, but this would still be prime because there's a plus sign there. This is the difference of squares, so you must have a subtraction sign. So if you see one that looks like this, this would be prime. Now, if we go up here with the greatest common factor, if you see one that looks like this, 7x plus, I don't know, let's do 15, all right, and you can't take a greatest common factor out, then this would also be prime, all right, because there is no greatest common factor between 7 and 15. All right, now let's get to trinomials, which is what we've been working on this week. If we look at the first one, remember when we're factoring trinomials, we need to think of two numbers that multiply and give us this last term, and two numbers that add and give us this middle term, okay? Now we have a negative over here. So anytime we have a negative in the C position, that means that we are multiplying a positive and a negative, which means that you could think of it like this. It means that you could think of it as two numbers that subtract and give you this number in the middle, because these two numbers are going to have opposite signs, and therefore these two numbers are going to need to be subtracted by each other in order to give you that middle number. So now you would just think of factors of 38. Well, 38 is 2 times 19. 2 times 19. And 19 minus 2 is 17, so that would work out pretty well. So if we factor these trinomials, we could use 19 and 2. Right? So now you just need to figure out which one's going to be positive and which one's going to be negative. Well, you want a negative 17, so therefore the 19 should be the negative, whereas the 2 should be the positive, because negative 19 plus 2 would give you negative 17. If you wrote it the other way, then it would be 19 minus 2, which would be positive 17, and we needed a negative 17 in the B position. All right, same thing. We have a negative over here. So because of that, we're going to be dealing with two things that have opposite signs, meaning that we're going to be subtracting and getting this B value. Right? So let's do it. All right, so I know that 3 times 12 is 36. Now, let's say you would have thought of other factors. Let's say you would have thought of 9 times 4, right? 9 times 4 is also 36. But if you look at 9 times 4, it wouldn't subtract and give you this 9. So you wouldn't be. So you have to keep looking for different multiples of C until you find 2 that would actually subtract and give you that middle number. All right, and that would be 12 and 3. All right, so we'd be using 12 and 3 here. Now, which one's going to have our negative this time? Well, we want a positive 9, right? So that means we want the 12 to be positive and the 3 to be negative, because 12 minus 3 is 9. And 12 times negative 3 is still negative 36. All right, w squared minus 16w plus 64. So this time we have a positive C, meaning both of our numbers have to multiply and give us a positive. Remember, there are only 2 ways that you could get a positive when you're multiplying, and that's when you're multiplying 2 positive numbers and when you're multiplying 2 negative numbers. All right, so we're going to have the same sign on both of our numbers this time. Now, how do I know what sign it's going to be? We'll look at this b value. The b value is negative. So two positive numbers wouldn't add up to a negative number. So it looks like we're going to be dealing with two negative numbers here. And 64, well, that's 8 times 8. And negative 8 plus negative 8 happens to be negative 16. So that would work. It would be w minus 8 and w minus 8. Negative 8 minus 8, or negative 8 plus negative 8 is negative 16. And negative 8 times negative 8 is positive 64. And then the last one, we have subtraction again, which means that we are going to be dealing with two numbers. I'm sorry, we have subtraction, or we have a minus sign in front of the c value, which means that we're going to be dealing with two numbers that have opposite signs again. So, meaning we're going to be looking for two numbers that would subtract and give you 27, and multiply and give you 90, and that would be 30 and 3, right? So if we have 30 and 3, which one would be the negative, which one would be the positive? Well, we want a negative 27, so therefore we want the 30 to be negative, because negative 30 plus 3 is negative 27. Whereas if you had the 3 negative, that would have given you a positive 27. All right, number 10. And all of these will be labeled on your test. So when you have to take a GCF out first, it's going to tell you. When you have to do slip and slide, it's going to tell you. So make sure you follow the directions really clearly. Now, number 10, we're not going to do slip and slide for number 10. Number 10, we're taking the greatest common factor out. And then we're factoring. So this is kind of like what we did on Tuesday. So if you look at your three coefficients, or your three numbers here, we have 2, 4, and 2. So it looks like we could factor out a 2. If we factor out a 2, we divide, we have m squared minus 2m plus 1. Right? This is just very similar to the first few problems, just taking the greatest common factor out. And then we go ahead and factor. So we're looking for two numbers that give you a positive 1, and then add and give you a negative 2. So because we have a positive 1 in the C position, that means our two numbers are going to have the same signs. So we're either going to be dealing with two positives or two negatives. In this case, because b is negative 2, we're dealing with two negatives. So there's going to be 2 times m, and then 1 times 1 is 1. So it's going to be 1 minus 1. And that's going to be, not 1 minus 1, I'm sorry, it's going to be n minus 1 and n minus 1. Because negative 1 plus negative 1 is negative 2. And negative 1 times negative 1 is positive 1. Alright. So here we'll be taking the greatest common factor out first. So the greatest common factor of 4, 4, and 120 is in fact 4. But if you look at the variables, we could also take out a variable. It looks like all three terms have at least one y. So we could go ahead and take out one y, because we always take out the variable with the lowest exponent. That's the one we factor out. So if we do that, we'd be left with, well, 4 divided by 4 is 1. Y to the third divided by y is y squared. And then that's plus 4 divided by 4 is 1. And then you take 1y out of y squared, you're just left with 1. And that's minus 120 divided by 4 is 30. And we took a y out, so we don't have any y's left. So now we're looking for a negative number, meaning we're going to be dealing with two numbers that have different signs, opposite signs. And we want a number that adds and gives us, or subtracts and gives us that positive 1, which would be 6 and 5. So bring the number, the greatest common factor out, which is 4y, bring it down, and let's go ahead and write it. Y plus 6, y minus 5. And the reason why the 6 is positive is because we're looking for a positive 1 in the y position. Alright, last three problems will be slip and slide. So, with these problems, you are not going to be able to factor anything out. Okay, so because of that, it doesn't necessarily mean it's prime. We could still possibly factor this by using the slip and slide technique. So the way you would use a slip and slide technique, you should know, hopefully. But we did this yesterday. You would take the leading coefficient here, and you'd slip it in front of the 9, meaning you would multiply it by the 9, and you'd rewrite the trinomial. So it would be b squared plus 12b plus 36. And then you would go ahead and factor. So we're looking for two numbers that give us a positive and two numbers that add and give us a positive. So because c is positive, that means both of our numbers are either going to both be positive or both be negative. It looks like both of our numbers are going to be positive because the 12 is positive. Now 6 times 6 is what gives us 36. So this is going to be b plus 6 and b plus 6, because 6 plus 6 is 12, and 6 times 6 is 36. Now if you're using the slip and slide technique, what you would do next is divide by that leading coefficient, divide by that term that you slipped in front of the 9, and simplify the fractions. So it would be b plus 3 over 2 and b plus 3 over 2. And then this is where you would slide. You would slide that denominator in front of your variable. Okay, so that would change our, or that would make our answer 2b plus 3 times 2b plus 3. That is slip and slide, and that is your answer. Let's take a look at number 13. So we would slip this 3 in front of the 16, meaning we would multiply 3 times 16, we get c squared plus 2c minus 48. Now we're looking for two numbers that have opposite signs, and that would subtract and give us 2 since they do have opposite signs. And 48 would be 6 times 8, so it looks like that's going to be, those are going to be our two numbers. So it's going to be c and 8 and c and 6. Now which one would have the negative and which one would have the positive sign? It looks like in this case the 8 is going to be positive and the 6 is going to be negative, because we want a positive 2 here. Alright, now once we factor it, we go ahead and divide by that leading coefficient and simplify our fractions. We can't do anything to 8/3, so we're just going to leave it as 8/3. Now c minus 6 over 3, that would simplify to c minus 2. And then we slide that denominator in front of that c, and that would give us our final answer, which is 3c plus 8 times c minus 2. That's your final answer. And then our last one, slip and slide. I take the 6, slide it in front of that 6, which would mean that we'd multiply it. So this would be m squared minus 13m plus 36. Alright, now we're looking for two numbers that give us a positive, and when we multiply them and they add up to a negative, so that would mean that we were dealing with two negative numbers. So it's going to be m minus something and m minus something. Well, 36 is 9 times 4, and 9 plus 4 happens to be negative 13. So it's going to be negative 9 and negative 4. Then we would go ahead and divide by that leading coefficient, that 6, and simplify. So this is going to be m minus 3 over 2 and m minus 2 over 3. And then we slide that denominator in front of our variable. Slide, that's where the slide comes in, the slip and slide. So this will be 2m minus 3 and 3m minus 2. And that is it. That's your study guide. Make sure you review and do some more problems, and be ready for your test tomorrow. Have a great night.